If there's one thing you should know about these Triumphs, it's that they're tiny. Especially when compared to what's on the roads here in Canada, at least. This lack of space, compounded by lack of working space, has definitely complicated life for a couple of newbies like us. Yet, we've actually made pretty good progress in reimagining the car with inspiration from the Jag F-Type R, as they're both front-engine, rear-wheel drive, two-seater GTs, so why not? Why shouldn't we have the same power-to-weight ratio? Earlier in the series, we rebuilt the soon-to-be-scrapped shell, and sold pretty much everything else to give us a clean slate and help another enthusiast at the same time. There's been a ton of work since then to pull our completely new powertrain together, and you can check out all of it in the playlist linked here. In the meanwhile though, with the prop shaft taken care of last time, that's the final major component of the drivetrain sorted, and it signifies the end of one phase and beginning of another. That being the lack of an exhaust. Seeing as it's one of the larger items still on the to-do list, it makes sense to take care of it next, so we can plan around it for other items later. Granted, some future components will have very few options for placement, so we need to bear that in mind, but still, as much as I feel a bit like a broken record at this point, how hard can it be? Our somewhat arduous task here has at least been kicked off by these manifolds introduced back in episode 15, which thankfully simplify our V8 down to just one exhaust outlet per side. Still though, we need to build the rest of the system from scratch, as outrageously GT6 LS swap parts aren't available yet. It's inexplicable. With a hair over 4 inches of ground clearance though, running the exhaust under the frame is likely a bad idea, and when you're really cramped for space, there are two obvious solutions. Full Cletus specs straight out the hood, or the somewhat more restrained approach of side pipes. In my opinion, there's only two good solutions for side pipes: externally like a Cobra, or through the body like a Viper. Now, I love the Cobra, more than I probably should, but as much as they have similarities, this isn't actually a Cobra, and I don't really think it needs to try to be one. So let's go through the body like a Viper then. If only some idiot hadn't put a frame in our way.
No.
Okay, if we can get our heads around it looking like a Cobra, we could cut into the sills and recess the pipes in a bit. But then you still have to worry about burning your leg, blowing your eardrums, and one other issue we haven't acknowledged yet. It just looks a bit bare back here, don't you think? I mean, yeah, it's a sharp tail end, but we really feel it needs some exhaust pipes to complete the look. And to be honest, this is what we've been planning all along. I don't really want to turn this whole video into exhaust design, but here we go. Put simply, an engine is an air pump. Air, fuel, hopes, dreams, and money go in, witchcraft happens, and music exhaust comes out. Preferably without passing through your lungs. Now, your lungs and the environment will be a lot happier if you use catalytic converters, as they employ precious metals to create a series of chemical reactions that can change harmful substances into slightly less harmful ones. Here in Ontario, Canada, emissions testing isn't required in the same way as a few years ago, but to get the car registered for the roads, you do still need to meet or exceed the emissions it complied with from factory. This is based on VIN numbers, and fortunately for us, not only did our car not have an OBD2 port, EGR valve, or any kind of computer control whatsoever, CATs were also not needed in 71, so we can save some cash and room by not using them. This also means we're slightly less likely to have them cut off by some thieving maniac. So with that out of the way, let's design the system. 2.5-inch tubing will easily handle our power level, and we'd like 2 complete runs of that with an X-pipe close to the front to promote exhaust scavenging. That being a technique where inherent small areas of vacuum actually help to pull gases out of the system. Again, witchcraft. From there, we'll need some kind of muffling device, a few turns, and I think a special finishing touch will be in order. Speaking of ordering, check this out. When it comes to buying exhaust components, price is really only limited by how much you want to spend. Materials being the main area of impact, be it mild steel, all the way up to titanium. We chose 304 Stainless, as even 409 does begin to corrode on the surface over time, and although that's mostly aesthetic, I still don't want it on our car. You can spend an arm and a leg and a kidney on this stuff, but thankfully we got a pretty smoking deal for this 16-piece set, and although the mandrel bends aren't perfect, I think we can work with them. We did splurge for a Borla muffler to handle the task of noise reduction, and it's a pretty sweet unit with a straight-through design and an integrated X-pipe, which will save space and should produce a smooth tone. Some clamps and flanges will hold things together while still keeping it removable, and we just chose these simple band clamps instead of the more elaborate and expensive V-bands, as they get the job done and still don't require gaskets. So then, that should be everything. Now just the exhausting task of putting it all together. Oh, pipe down. One of our patrons dared us to make this all work with just those 4 clamps you saw. And Brian, as much as I like a challenge, we've got bigger problems. Cutting and welding will be imperative to make this work, but beyond trivial details like not knowing how to TIG weld, there's the issue of actually cutting the tubing. Normally, I'd just reach for the grinder, but this time we've borrowed its big brother from one of my big brothers. And although it may come as a surprise to some of you, even here in Canada, winter is in fact over now. This footage was just taken a little while ago. That chop saw should make cuts on straight pipe quite easy now, but curved tubing still poses a problem. So I think I feel a jig coming on. Let me rephrase that. We need a device to hold the tubing so that any angle of cut will always be square to the centerline radius, which is a fancy way of saying we need to cut like so. If you don't, the face of the cut will become an oval and won't mate up with the joining pieces. So while it does have applications, it's just not here. The jig design we're building is inspired by a few others I've seen, and our first step is to attach a plate to the saw's base using the existing hardware. Ideally, we'd use something a bit thicker than this, but we're going with what we had on hand. A slice through it is needed, otherwise it wouldn't really do anything, and with a couple of end stops clamped square to the blade, we can weld them on. We used 2 end stops, as the original one seen here was offset from the cutting wheel quite a bit and would not brace the highest point of the bend. A strip of sheet metal then got carefully shaped using a precision die and now fits snugly inside a 180-degree piece of tubing. At this point, you may have a much clearer idea of how things will work. The huge benefit to this design is you can use it to cut any angle as well as straight tubing, so setup time should be greatly reduced. After clamping that bent strip in place and making sure everything was evenly centered on the initial cut, it received a few tacks, and thankfully everything still works as intended, albeit a bit on the tight side perhaps. The last step is to cut a slot through the top ring, and with a little cleanup we'll have a somewhat flimsy yet perfectly reasonable jig made from scrap, and I have no doubt it will help a lot. We even maintained the original position of the cutting disc relative to the tube, so all in all, I think it's time to head under the car. And we're under the car. So we've got the muffler sort of propped up into position here. We just got a few little pieces of pipe shoved into it to hold it. We actually got a little piece of cardboard here as well, helping to hold it up at the height that we're intending, because this needs to clear things. And that's sitting pretty well. We got our little band clamps on there. And what we need to do is get from here to back there. We're gonna start at the back, because this actually should be easier than the front, and we're amateurs, so we're gonna go with the easier thing first. To get there though, we got a few things to snake around. This is not a fuel tank. It is a mock-up fuel tank, don't worry. It's just filling a hole, it's giving us something to work around, but that's roughly where it's going to live. That'll be an episode in the future. We gotta go underneath the diff. That does make it kind of low to the ground, but it is what it is. The standard C4 exhaust setup went underneath it, and at least being where the tires are, if the car goes over a speed bump, it all goes up with it. You shouldn't bottom out. So to get here, we're gonna have to drop the exhaust a little bit and then straighten back out. We have to then take a fairly sharp 90, come up here. We'd like to parallel this bat wing coming out so that it's on a nice angle and looks aesthetically pleasing. And then another 90. So we're gonna start there first. We're gonna try to get down to here. So let's get cutting. Indeed, and we'll start by slicing a piece of 180 in half. Now, finding center with our jig is not exactly straightforward, but neither is it completely by eye. The most difficult aspect of measuring the angle is that this tubing has flares on one end and isn't actually a full bend. That 180 is closer to a 170 or maybe 175 degrees, and the same thing goes for all the other pieces. Regardless, those came up pretty darn similar, and we can grab one of my new carbide burrs and a drill to clean up the burrs. Well, that makes sense now. I shouldn't have to tell you, these things are awesome and totally worth the $5 each. I'm just kind of wondering why I've held off getting them for so long, to be honest. On subsequent cuts, we found the flap disc did a slightly better job cleaning the outside edge, so we'll mainly use the burrs for the inner ones going forward. The half with the flare is going to be used later, so the remaining bit we just cut is getting an additional 45 degrees of bend removed, and when you spin it around, you get an S shape, which in our case should drop the exhaust the perfect amount to clear the differential. We just need to clean them up. Excellent, and they seem to fit together pretty well. I've heard that 2-inch masking tape works extraordinarily well for holding pieces together, and this so happens to be true. So with that, we can take it back under the car again to see how it's fitting. So we got that little dropped piece, we got a little tick mark, so I'll slide it in up to that tick, which is there. Make sure the muffler's positioned approximately in where it needs to be. That's dropped it down to clear the bottom of the diff, which we should very nicely. I mean it's tight, but we wanted it to be tight. So now, I think something around 8 3/4 would get us to a point that we can start turning. In case you worry about sparks, you're not alone. We do our fair share of joking around here, but we always keep an extinguisher nearby and hang around for a while after working to be sure we're good to go. Losing all this hard work to stupidity would be pretty dumb. Yeah. So then that'll bring us back to there, and then we can do a 90 and carry on. Part of the puzzle with designing an exhaust system is making sure you're not wasting material and reducing the amount of cuts and welds that are necessary. Case in point, the next 90 is going to be taken from this piece. As the flared end is scrap anyways, it'll only need one weld to join up, and the remaining leg will be long enough to reach around the gas tank. With all 4 pieces taped together then, we've slammed them back in place to continue checking how this is working out, and I gotta say, it's looking pretty darn snazzy. One more 90 gives reference for where we're headed next, and it looks like we've got clearance to the frame, bottom of the diff, back of the diff, the fuel tank, and on the whole, we're happy enough that we can swap it all over to check the fitment for the other side. This is probably the most irritating part of what we're up to. Everything has to be done twice, while also keeping it exactly the same from side to side, as there's really no good reason to do otherwise. Any error will simply emphasize our incompetence, and I don't really think I could live with that, so better to be OCD now and not regret it later, right? Right? Oh, come on, man. I earned this from last time, Shirley.
Please don't call me Shirley.
Anyway, the initial cuts were replicated as closely as possible, and with our desk cleared off for probably the first time in years, we could clamp them together and devise a repeatable solution for setting the angles. I think it worked out okay, so once again, let's head under the car and try them both up for size. About 5 seconds later, we got one of those. The cardboard needs to get sort of evened up there too. Well, I like it. I'm a beginner TIG welder, in case it wasn't obvious. This little section here and that little section there, though, are just 2 cutoffs that I did today. And I have fusion welded them back together, so I have pulse on this TIG, which is pretty nice. So I set it at 1 pulse per second, and just melted them back together again. This area is sort of being wire brushed a little bit. This area is just straight off the welder. And quite honestly, for some of my very first welds that have turned out decent, I'm pleased with those. So, you know, this whole project is a learning experience, and we're saying at this point, let's just, you know, carry on and actually try to weld some parts that we need together, because I'm using gas anyways. Something that I did not do with those parts, though, and I feel could help a lot, is I cleaned the inside of this part. And when you look at the difference, there's a lot of junk in there. We wiped it out first with some acetone, that got a lot of that junk, and then I came in here with a Scotch-Brite and cleaned that. That can't hurt anything. I think all that crud on the inside seeping through the weld to the outside is not going to be doing me any good. So let's clean up this one too, and then we can actually try tacking them together. That was a lot of fun. What we've ended up with here is this piece is now actually tacked together, and we're very pleased with it. We got a similar, obviously, shape to what we've got here, but what we were trying to maintain the entire time was keeping this pipe here and here straight in line. So if I take this, it's not fitting in anywhere along there or anywhere along there. We actually switched over to this piece of MDF because we found out that the plywood we were using had a bow in it, and that was throwing off everything as we were trying to set it up. Because it fit one way, and then if you flipped it over, it'd be completely different. This, though, is still nice and straight all the way along, so that's awesome. These mandrel bends were, like, cheap compared to what I was finding elsewhere, which is great, and the mandrel bends are perfectly decent, but what you run into is it's just not the right, it's not perfect fit now. It almost feels like a bit of a T-joint that we've got to fill a corner when we're welding it up. So anyways, there's just a couple of little tacks holding things together right now. We need to add some more, and then we can actually weld them up fully. I wasn't about to film myself for these first important welds, as the camera is just one more thing to think about, and frankly I always perform at my worst when it's recording. Regardless, they're still far from perfect, but they're also not as shockingly bad as they could be. As mentioned, we worked hard to keep them straight, as it's pretty easy to start wandering off course, but I think this is acceptable. Most importantly, they should at least hold together, so let's rock and roll. Back under the car again, we've got the freshly welded parts clamped in place and leveled out, and by measuring the batwing as 12 degrees, we can hold the next pipe up to match and draw some alignment marks to get everything exactly where we need it. You probably got the idea by now, but there's an awful lot of back and forth to make this happen. And with the pipes removed once again, we can head to the, shall we say, fab table? Made up the alignment marks, and quickly zap in the first tack. As much as I still suck at this, TIG welding is awesome. A single tack on its own is very weak, of course, so some careful repositioning is needed, and a helping hand to pull the joint up tight never hurts. Of course, a clamp can sometimes be even better than a hand, and this old faithful helped to get the slight unevenness back in line.
That's nice.
That's not bad. I'm waiting for a weld to go snap.
I don't think you need to in that.
Perhaps not. That's all pulled it up very nicely.
Good.
So weird.
So weird.
Those welds, they obviously pull hard because we're pulling against it and we're not getting anything, and then you weld it and it's like, whoop, perfect. What? How's that even possible? Now, I haven't actually checked this yet, but we should be about right. Oh. Nobody saw that. See, it was perfect. This should be about 12, which it is. And if I flip that around, trying to make sure I don't get the bumps on the side of the phone, of course, with the buttons. That side is also 12. Obviously pleased with how it's all looking down here, let's give the pipes a good clean to make sure I've got the best chance at running some decent welds.
I'm losing on my acetone.
Well, you're premature, weren't you?
I wasn't anticipating you being so slow.
We call this the Canadian Am I in the right headspace for this? I don't know.
The answer is yes.
I don't know.
The answer is yes.
Oh, you're turning it on and everything, are you?
Yeah, you're going to need a helmet, aren't you? Of course, we have no way of seeing it.
Well, we can
inside.
We'll cut it apart afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Cut it apart. Have a look.
Experienced TIG welders are probably screaming at me right now for using a wire brush, among other things. But as we chose not to back purge, this step gives us a different look that we're quite partial to. Shiny. Every time I rewatch footage, I see more and more mistakes. I'm moving too fast, I'm not consistent, but you know what? It's fused together, and my OCD can actually handle that for once. We've now got 2 matching pipes that take us from the muffler to behind the diff, and next time we'll push on from there. So if you enjoy what we're up to, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell some friends. Our most sincere gratitude to all the incredible patrons and donators who support our shenanigans, and if you'd like to help contribute, please check out the links below. Stay up to speed on social media at Fanatik Builds, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.